What is the real cornbread? If you ask people around the United States today, you will get so many different answers. Cornbread has to be sweet, or it has to be made out of white cornmeal or yellow cornmeal. Maybe it can't have sugar in it, or it has to be a particular shape. But my question is, what is the real cornbread from 250 years ago or 300 years ago? Now, I know you're already jumping into the comment section telling us what your cornbread is. And for me, I grew up in northern Indiana, so cornbread is yellow, and for me personally, it came out of a little blue box. Cornbread is a dish of the Americas. Depending on how you look at it, cornbread has been made for literally thousands of years by the Native Americans. But what about when European settlers come to the New World? They have their own idea of exactly what bread is. Now, that can be a diverse answer, but most people think of bread as wheaten bread. It's a large, fluffy loaf, and they come to the Americas and they don't have wheat. It doesn't grow well here, at least right off the bat, and so they have to work with Native American corn. Native American corn does not easily turn into something like wheaten bread. It is just not made of the right kind of stuff. The lack of gluten within the corn really doesn't allow the yeast anything to work upon, so you don't get these wonderful, nice air pockets inside of your bread. Now, interestingly, even within Great Britain, there were regions and cultures that had different main grains that grew there. So barley in some place, oats in another area, or rye. Now, these grains don't make very good bread either. And the people that grew those grains in those particular regions wanted bread, and they had to make a bread substitute with those. And they usually had to make do with oat cakes or barley cakes, something that most people wouldn't consider as bread. But those people that lived in those regions, they actually liked those types of bread better than wheaten bread generally, unless they wanted to look like they were upper class or middle class people that could afford the more expensive wheat bread. Exactly the same thing happens in North America. Corn doesn't make regular bread, and so people end up making Johnny cakes or maybe hoe cakes. These are just little flat cakes, which we wouldn't call bread at all. Very flat, kind of grainy, and with a very distinct taste. Now, most people still wanted real bread. How did they make real bread with corn? Now, there certainly is a distinction between cornbread and bread made with corn. These Europeans are looking for bread, the kind of normal bread they're used to, and so they're going to be making a bread made with some corn. But generally it's made with a combination of other grains, usually wheat or possibly rye, sometimes all three. When we look at the descriptions, and descriptions are all we have these simple ideas of, well, they made their bread with corn and wheat and rye, or they made their bread with corn and wheat. Sometimes they say they made their bread with just corn, but no matter how you try to make bread with just corn, it really doesn't turn out to be anything like what they would call bread. As ubiquitous as bread made with corn was in the 18th century, the funny thing is we really don't have any recipes for it. There are no American cookbooks from the 18th century except for Amelia Simmons's little cookbook from 1796-97. And corn is used in this little cookbook, but never does she make anything that we would call cornbread or even bread at all. She does have a recipe for Johnny cakes, so there's something like a little flat cornbread, but we have to look at other works to even get a concept for what their bread made with corn was like. Our first real recipes that we get for bread made with corn or something like cornbread comes in the 19th century. In The Art of Bread, in 1804, we have a maize bread recipe. And this one is a description of bread, or a recipe for bread, that really meets the description all through the 17th and 18th century about how they basically made their bread with corn. The recipe reads like this: take a peck of the meal of maize. Mix it up with water and boil it over a fire till it comes to the consistency of paste. Then take a peck of wheat flour and knead both together with a proper proportion of salt and yeast into a dough. Allow it to stand before the fire for 2 hours to ferment, and then divide it into loaves and put them in the oven. Pretty simple recipe. It's almost as simple as regular bread, but with the corn, we have to boil it up into basically a cornmeal mush, and then we mix that with our wheat, and that will turn into something like, well, what we would consider cornbread. Now, we're not going to make a giant recipe here. We just need to boil 1 cup of cornmeal in a little bit of water. We want to boil it in just enough water that we get a nice thick paste. This will take a little bit of time, so stir it the entire time or it'll burn on the bottom of the pan. We're going to allow this paste to cool off. I'm just going to spread it around this bowl, and then we can mix it with our wheat flour. And I'm going to use just 1 cup of wheat flour here. I'll use a whole wheat flour, and we're going to knead this together. It's going to create a very, very loose dough, and we can mix that with a little bit of yeast. I've got a little liquid yeast here and some salt. Once we've got this mixed up, we can put it right into something like a pie pan, or if you want a loose loaf, you can also do that, but it's going to spread out. So the best way to really bake this is to bake it in some sort of a pan, either a little square pan or a pie pan like I've got here. I would let this rise for about an hour. It will kind of puff up a little bit, give it room to grow, and you can bake this, I would say, in a pie pan, something like 35 or 45 minutes at about 400 degrees. Now, can we make cornbread without any flour? Yes. A little bit later, we have The Virginia Housewife by Mary Randolph. This is 1824, and she makes a cornmeal bread. She says, rub a piece of butter the size of an egg into a pint of cornmeal. Make it into a batter with 2 eggs and some new milk. Add a spoonful of yeast, set it by the fire to rise. Butter little pans and bake it. This recipe seems to be the first one that gives us our classic concept of cornbread as we know it today. We're going to take that butter and rub it into our pint of cornmeal. We're going to add in 2 eggs and some new milk. Now, new milk, we probably just want to use regular whole milk in this case. Again, a spoonful of liquid yeast. A regular packet of yeast is going to work fine for this. We're going to set it by the fire to rise and bake it in those smaller tins. This is the real cornbread from 250 years ago. It doesn't look like bread, does it? It doesn't look like your standard loaf of bread. It's flat. Even when I tried to get it to become a loaf, this is as much as you could possibly get out of it. In fact, there is one reference where they talked about making it, and they would basically pile it up on the thing and it would kind of flatten out like this, and then they would put more on top of it and let it bake, and then put more on top of it and let it bake to try to build it up. It doesn't work very well. But if we're here just for taste, then let's find out what it tastes like. So I've got this one. This is the half and half that has wheat flour and cornmeal in it and yeast, and that's it. That's all there is to it. It kind of looks like it has a typical cornbread texture to it, and it does have some leavening in there. It's not just super dense, and it smells a lot more bready than you might expect. It does have a cornbread smell, but you know, and it's very, very flavorful compared to bread that we eat today. You know, even a whole wheat loaf doesn't have a whole lot of flavor to it. You put butter on it, you put other things on it. Bread by itself, other than the crust, doesn't have a lot of flavor. This is like crust all the way through, flavor-wise. You don't really end up with a true crust on it like you would a crusty bread. So this is the typical cornbread from 300 years ago. Now, if we go to the later cornbread, this is probably closer to what we would consider a cornbread, the Virginia Housewife. It doesn't have as bready a texture This holds together as almost a bread. This is a lot more crumbly. I think it's a lot more like what we would consider some kinds of cornbread today. A little grittier, you know. Compared to so many cornbreads that you might have today, whether it's made from scratch or it's made out of a box, the trouble to go to make this one is definitely worth it.